Can a single decision in a second save you from death? Watch how fleeting moments turned into a battle between life and death. What would you have done if you were in their place? When you were young, I didn't know back then that my steps would lead me to face fears that never sleep. I was 10 years old when I received an invitation to a sleepover. I felt a strange anxiety coursing through my veins, despite my innocence. My mother always warned me against staying out too late because she knew exhaustion would catch up with me the next day. She would whisper words of reassurance, telling me that if I wanted to leave, she would come to get me, no matter how late it was. I arrived at the host girl's house, and the sleepover seemed routine on the surface. We watched a movie, chatted, laughed, and played a Ouija board game, which seemed to us like a way to summon hidden secrets from worlds we didn't understand. It turned out that the girl hosting the sleepover had an older brother in high school, and he had invited some of his friends over. I remember them standing at the door of the entertainment room where we were. There was something about their behavior that made my blood run cold, and all I could think was, I want to go home. Then they started staring at us. I began to feel that something unnatural was about to happen. I realized then that my heart was pounding with rising fear, so I decided to seek refuge. I went upstairs to look for a phone and whispered that I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. At first, the host's mother refused my request and scolded me, thinking I was just a child who couldn't understand things. But I was determined to listen to my intuition, which was screaming at me to leave that place. Moment after moment passed until she finally allowed me to use the phone. I called my mother, and with every beat of my heart, I felt like I was on the verge of survival. When her car appeared and stopped at a small spot in Dairy Queen, I felt an overwhelming relief, as if I had escaped the grip of an unknown danger. Fear accompanied me with every step, and even now, the whispers and shadows from that house still echo in my memory. Years have passed, and I still tremble when I recall that night, which carried painful secrets. I later discovered that the young man and his friends had harassed some of the girls at the sleepover while they were asleep. They were behind hidden events that turned into a nightmare for several girls as they slept, with no one finding the courage to tell the world what had happened. It took a long time for the girls to realize they weren't alone in their suffering. I feel deep sadness for those who endured that bitter experience, but I remain grateful that I listened to my intuition and left that place. Have you ever wondered what happens when the night turns into an unforgettable nightmare? I was at a party at the house of one of my closest friends at the time. My friend lived with her brother and a close friend of theirs, and they had invited about 50 people, all of whom were acquaintances. The atmosphere was full of fun. Some were playing outside, others were chatting inside, cooking, and enjoying their time. After a few hours, I returned home after several rounds of beer pong and cornhole outside. In a quick glance, I noticed the place had become very crowded, yet I didn't recognize anyone. I started wandering around, looking for a familiar face. I felt a terrifying sensation telling me that staying there wouldn't end well, and that hidden danger was lurking. Finally, I found my close friend and told her I was going home. I hugged her, took my keys from her room, and headed to my car. 5 minutes into driving, my phone started ringing non-stop. Naively, I thought they were calling to ask for more drinks, so I ignored the calls and arrived home, then went to sleep. The next morning, my phone rang again, and I answered. The caller revealed that shortly after I left, a large group of people none of us knew had arrived. They started smashing windows and throwing glass everywhere. My friend, her boyfriend, her brother, who was 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 350 pounds, and their mutual friend tried to calm the situation and convince the strangers to leave, but they didn't respond. Among the group were some girls, possibly acquaintances, who grabbed my friend by her hair and dragged her to the front yard, where they began beating her. Her boyfriend tried to intervene and save her, but the men grabbed him and tried to hit him too. Then her massive brother stepped in, grabbed two of them and threw them onto the rocks. Suddenly, two of the strangers came out armed with guns and started firing. A bullet grazed her boyfriend's head, luckily just a scratch on the right side. Another bullet hit a neighboring house, while a third ricocheted and struck one of the girls who was attacking my friend. Everyone inside the house fled, and then the strangers ran away, leaving my friends lying in the front yard. My friend suffered bruises, wounds, broken ribs, and half of her hair was torn out from being dragged. Her boyfriend survived with a superficial wound, while her brother only had scratches. Their mutual friend suffered some bruises from the chaos of people trying to escape. To this day, 8 years later, we still don't know who those people were. No one confessed, and the police didn't find enough evidence to take action or issue arrest warrants. Can you imagine the feeling of fear and regret overwhelming your heart when you foresee the fate of someone you love? I considered our neighbor Adam like the older brother I had always wished for. He was a man in his 30s, full of life and talent, obsessed with fitness, and successful in singing, playing every instrument, dancing, and cooking. He would take me and my younger brother to the beach whenever he had the chance. 3 days before my 14th birthday, I was on my way to school when I saw a strange flash, like a dream that vanished in an instant. I saw Adam suddenly getting into an accident and dying instantly. I felt like crying, but I convinced myself it was probably just the effect of a movie I had watched the night before. I went about my day coldly, but deep in my heart there was a voice warning of something serious. At 8 p.m., my parents received a phone call, and their expressions changed horrifyingly. They left in a hurry without explaining what had happened. The next morning, I woke up to the worst news of my life. Adam was no longer alive. He had been in a horrific accident the night before and died instantly at the scene. I was overwhelmed with shock and consumed by indescribable regret, because just hours before his death, I had felt something ominous warning of a dark danger. I couldn't sleep for days, blaming myself intensely, believing that my warning could have saved him if I had alerted him. 7 years have passed since that day, and whenever I remember Adam, his smile, his love for life, and his spirit that brightened my days, I feel a deep pain in my heart. To this day, I wonder why that feeling came to me before the tragedy, and I am still haunted by a fear of a fate that could have changed the course of our lives. I was 12 years old, and there was nothing I loved more than spending the night at my grandmother's house. It was a weekly tradition. Every Thursday night I would go there and feel safe and warm. But that night I felt something strange, a hidden sensation telling me I should stay home. I told my mom I didn't want to go this time. I didn't have an explanation, but she reluctantly agreed. I spent the evening at home, watched some TV, and then decided to sleep. My room was next to the living room, and I wasn't fully asleep when I heard my mom repeatedly calling my dad's name. There was something odd in her voice, a mix of fear and anxiety. I slowly crept into the living room and saw my dad sitting on the couch, his head tilted back, snoring loudly. At first glance it seemed normal, but it wasn't. My mom was shaking him forcefully, trying to wake him up, her face terrified. Then she turned to me and screamed for me to go back to bed. But I didn't move. Something inside me made me run to their bedroom. I grabbed the phone and called emergency services with a trembling voice. I told the operator that my dad was asleep and my mom was trying to wake him, but he wasn't responding. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I felt like time was running out. I moved the call to the living room and handed the phone to my mom, who began speaking frantically with the operator. Meanwhile, I sat on the floor, holding my dad's hand, and repeating in a shaky voice that I loved him. After what felt like hours, the ambulance arrived with its bright lights and sirens that shattered the night's silence. They carried him inside and drove away, while I stood frozen, watching them leave. We didn't yet know exactly what had happened, but the next day, the full truth became clear. My dad had taken an entire bottle of diazepam in an attempt to end his life. Every time I revisit that night, I think about one thing. What if I hadn't been there? What if I hadn't called for help? What if I had gone to my grandmother's house as usual? Would he have survived? I don't have an answer, but what I do know is that the strange feeling that came over me that evening was more than just a fleeting sensation. It was a faint whisper that saved a life. I was 12 years old when my mom left me alone at home to run some errands. After she left, the doorbell rang, and I was surprised because we lived on a hill with only 2 neighbors, and no one usually visited our house. I looked through the frame of a picture and saw a young man I didn't know, wearing a cotton shirt and jeans. He looked suspicious, so I waited for him to leave without daring to do anything. The man stood there smoking in an isolated spot, and I, alone, began to feel afraid. I hid and decided to wait until my mom returned, unable to use the phone for fear he might notice me. Suddenly, my mom came rushing back and asked if I was okay. She told me she had felt a strange urge calling her to return home immediately, even though she had just started her errands. She quickly turned around and found the man in our yard, asking him what he wanted. He muttered something vague about looking for someone, and my mom ordered him to leave immediately. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or how my mom knew to come back, but I am incredibly grateful that she acted when she felt something wasn't right. I live in an area rarely hit by hurricanes. One day, a major storm was approaching, and the weather report warned of a possible tornado. I had never paid much attention to such warnings before, but this day was different. I was sitting on my recliner, my German Shepherd at my feet, watching the news intently. Then I felt a strange urge to grab my cats and put them in their carriers in the basement. After all, the worst-case scenario was that nothing would happen, and the cats would spend 30 minutes in their carriers unharmed. I returned to my recliner to continue watching the news when suddenly the sky turned green. The scene looked surreal and wrong. I told my wife to go downstairs, then picked up my 105-pound dog despite his strong resistance and carried him down the narrow stairs to the basement. As soon as my feet touched the basement floor, I felt a sudden drop in pressure. Then we heard a deafening roar, and the windows upstairs shattered. It lasted only 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When everything calmed down, I crept upstairs and peeked out the basement door to find all the windows broken. The recliner I had been sitting on just minutes before was covered in glass shards that would have cut my face if I hadn't moved quickly. It turned out the tornado had passed directly over our house. The windows were destroyed, the roof was damaged, the fence was completely gone, the porch was torn off, and trees were down everywhere. I will always remember how my gut told me to take the situation seriously, and how listening to it saved my life. A year and a half ago, I left a concert hall with my unofficial girlfriend, her friend, and her friend's boyfriend, heading through the crowded street to a bar around 2:30 a.m. We had a quick shot of tequila and an endless night drink, then went outside to call an Uber. We sat on the curb waiting for the Uber when a group of people with stern faces approached us, looking for trouble. I glanced at my girlfriend and pulled her to stand up. Her look silently told me we needed to leave immediately. Not 5 seconds later, we heard a sound like an explosion piercing the silence. I felt something sharp pierce the back of my leg, though it wasn't very painful. We started running toward a police car parked across the street, seeking refuge from the danger. It later turned out that a bullet had hit the spot where we were sitting on the curb, causing stone fragments to scatter. One of those fragments had lodged itself in my leg without me realizing it at the time. That night, someone was killed, but my inner feeling saved me and my friends from a deadly bullet that wasn't even aimed at us. At first, I didn't realize I'd been injured by a piece of stone stuck in my leg until a police officer noticed the blood on my leg and thought I had been shot. After I quickly gave my statement, they took me to the emergency room, where they removed a stone fragment the size of half a marble from my leg while I was still heavily intoxicated. I returned home at 6 a.m. and didn't fully grasp the reality of what had happened until I sat down and thought, "Oh my God, how one moment of decision saved my life." I was surfing on an isolated coral reef beach located offshore across a channel in a very southern state of Australia. The weather was cloudy, and it was a perfect day for waves. I was surfing with only one other person, and we were taking turns in getting to know each other between waves. I asked him about his work, and he told me he was a marine biologist. He had recently moved to the area and was new to surfing there. Even though the waves were perfect, he told me after 40 minutes, "I'm not comfortable here. Something feels off. I feel like I'm being watched, like bait." I didn't want to leave because the waves were amazing. But since he was a marine biologist, I decided to trust his instincts and play it safe. We started paddling across the deep channel as quickly as possible without showing panic, then walked for 15 minutes back to the parking lot, making small talk along the way. I got his phone number so we could surf together later, especially since the town was small and I didn't know anyone there. We noticed a 15-foot rubber boat approaching the coral reef and staying there for a while, but we didn't think much of it. Later that night, while scrolling through social media, I read about 3 fishermen who were in the same spot we had been in that morning, around the same time. When they approached the shore to check their crab traps, a massive great white shark, the size of their boat, circled them twice. That man might have saved me from a terrifying experience that day. I sent him the link to the Facebook post about the incident and felt chills run through my body for 20 minutes. He was absolutely certain he had felt something, and he was completely right. Have you ever imagined that the last thing you feel in this world could be the warmth of your father's embrace? I was 13 years old, and my father worked in a coal mine on the night shift, which started at midnight and ended at noon. He would return home at 2 p.m., sleep until 9 p.m., then wake up so we could have dinner with him before he went back to work. My father was very strict, and he would yell if we woke him with any noise, something I understand now that I'm an adult. One day, I did something that woke him up, though I don't remember exactly what it was. He called me into his room, and I expected him to scold me harshly. But he looked at me and said without anger, "Come here and give me a hug." At that age, what boy asks for a hug from his father? And how could I accept that feeling that filled his heart? Then he continued in a low voice, "What if something happens to me while I'm lying there, exhausted and tired?" Despite everything, I didn't hug him, and that night I went to face an unknown fate. That night, an accident occurred in the mine. He saved all his colleagues and everyone he went back for, but he was the only one who didn't make it. I'm convinced he knew what was going to happen, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes that day, which carried a goodbye no one uttered. If someone asks you for a hug, give it to them. I love you, Dad. Have you ever wondered if the moments you've lived carry messages from a world that isn't easily understood? I was 8 years old in 1985, standing next to my friend in front of an old El Camino car. Inside was a man who claimed to know my mother, and he actually knew her name. But I felt something was wrong, so I grabbed my friend and we ran away. When I told my mother, her face turned pale, and she called the police. It later turned out that the man believed my mother had stolen his job at the steel factory where she worked, and he intended to harm her. He was already wanted for nearly killing his wife that morning. When I was 16, my mother had a bad feeling about a trip I was going to take with my friends. Even though my decision to go was foolish, I did it anyway. I was shocked when a car accident occurred, taking the lives of two of my closest friends. I was on the brink of death myself, and the accident will mark 30 years this coming November. I still regret getting into that car every day, and perhaps if I hadn't, my friends would still be alive. My mother had that mysterious maternal intuition, and she still has it to this day. Recently, I was at our countryside home with my eldest son, his wife, and their children. During a break in the storm, my son decided to return home instead of spending the night with us. I felt a deep dread at the thought of them leaving late, especially with the intermittent and violent storms. Tears streamed down my face as I begged them not to leave, and thankfully, they agreed. The next morning, we all headed home together, with my husband and I following each other on the road. When we reached a completely dark road at night, we found the police closing off a collapsed bridge. Cranes were pulling out submerged cars, so we got out of our vehicles to ask the officers what had happened. They told us that several cars had continued driving at night without realizing the bridge had collapsed. The sole survivor from the first car that fell reported that they had veered off the bridge around 9:30 p.m., exactly the time my son had wanted to leave. My husband looked at me silently while my son held me tightly, realizing exactly what could have happened. These stories are not just words. They are messages from fate reminding us that danger might be closer than we think, and survival could depend on a single heartbeat. If you felt the chills or excitement, don't forget. Like if the stories amazed you and left you wondering about the mysteries of life. Comment and share your thoughts. Which story scared you the most? Have you had a similar experience? Subscribe to the channel because the mystery isn't over yet. What's coming next is even more thrilling.